In this video we are going to take a closer look at a black-clad Space Marine shouting obscenities across the battlefield. That's every Deathwatch Marine, you say? Well, perhaps, but this one is wearing a skull helmet on top. Deathwatch Reavers finally gotten viable? No, you chesters, I am of course talking about the Chaplains. From foot slogging to jump back to bike, and even a named one, there are several datasheets to pick from, but which one of these are actually good in the Deathwatch? In order to answer this, we will first take a look at some base stats, abilities and wargear. Then we will go through how specifically make use of chaplains in a Deathwatch army. Lastly, there will be some modeling recommendations and a quick wrap up.
Welcome to SwissHammer, your channel for modeling in Warhammer 40k. My name is Tammer and I will be guiding you through this video.
For a Deathwatch army, the following 5 Chaplain datasheets are currently available for matched play. There is the classic Firstborn Chaplain, the Primaris Chaplain, the Primaris Chaplain on bike, the Chaplain in Terminator Armor, as well as our named character Chaplain Cassius. As the name suggests, the main reasons for these different datasheets are usually either a generational matter, aka Firstborn versus Primaris, or the armor type that they are wearing, which in turn affects their stats and abilities. Speaking of stats and abilities, in a nutshell, a Chaplain rocks a weapon skill of 2+, making him quite decent in close combat, where he is also wielding his signature weapon, the Crucius Arcanum. In case of the Primaris versions, he gets an extra wound and an extra attack. In case the Chaplain is riding a bike, his toughness goes up to 5, or in case of the Terminator Armor variant, he gets a 2+ armor save and the Teleport Strike ability, which is the standard for these types of datasheets. For abilities, Chaplains come with the Spiritual Leader's Aura, which allows core units within 6 inches to make use of the Chaplain's high leadership value of 9 rather than their own. While Deathwatch veterans and the other datasheets that can be included in a Proteus kill team already come with a comparably high leadership value of 8, the Chaplain's Aura can be quite useful for Primaris kill teams, as these datasheets only have a leadership value of 7. I guess their creator did not quite grasp the concept of they shall know no fear. Furthermore, they also come with a 4+ symbol save from the Rosarius ability. Chaplains have the Priest keyword, meaning that they have access to a bunch of litanies, which they can recite in your command phase and require a successful roll of a 3+ in order to be successful. Before we are going through these in more detail, a quick word on the chapter command upgrade at 25 points, promoting the Chaplain to a Master of Sanctity. For those already familiar with my guide to the apothecary, the concept here is very similar. The upgrade itself only allows the Chaplain to know 1 additional litany, which is great, but what we really want here is the wise Orator Warlord trait, which makes the litanies go off on a 2+ rather than a 3+, making them far more reliable. Furthermore, in case you wanted to use the commanding oratory stratagem, which autocasts a litany, you will now only spend 1 CP rather than 2 CP. Ultimately, as a rule of thumb, whenever you are investing into a Chaplain, it is highly recommended to go all the way and invest into both the Master of Sanctity as well as the Wise Orator Warlord trait, meaning whenever you are evaluating the costs of a Chaplain, consider the extra 25 points plus 1 CP spent. But returning to the Chaplain's litanies, by default, every Chaplain knows the Litany of Hate, and you can then pick 1 more on a regular Chaplain and yet another on a Master of Sanctity. As we just established, you always want to have the upgrade. They affect core and character units. This means that next to our kill teams, they can for instance also be used on Dreadnoughts. Quickly going through the litanies available, the default Litany of Hate is an aura ability and allows hit rerolls in close combat. We then have the Litany of Fate, also an aura, which grants a 5+ against mortal wounds. We then also have the Catechism of Fire and Exhortation of Rage, both targeted litanies that add 1 to the wound roll for ranged or close combat attacks respectively. Keep in mind that in the Deathwatch, and the Army of Renown in particular, we get plenty of access to wound rerolls, so these two litanies may not be as effective as some of their competitors. Speaking of which, we then have Mantra of Strength, which boosts the offensive output of the chaplain itself, something to which we will get to later in the video. Furthermore, we have Recitation of Focus, a targeted litany adding 1 to the hit roll of ranged attacks. This one is really excellent for our ranged kill teams in combination with Specialism Extremis, for instance. Then, speaking of excellent, we also have the Canticle of Hate, which adds +2 to charge rolls, and perhaps easily overlooked by beginners, you get additional 3 inches of movement for pile-in or consolidation, which translates in a lot of potentially free movement. As a rule of thumb, while all litanies can see some play depending on list, in the Deathwatch in particular, both Recitation of Focus for the +1 to the hit roll on ranged attacks, as well as Canticle of Hate for the extra charge and free movement, are 2 really strong picks that you cannot possibly go wrong with. With these basic rules covered, how can we best use a chaplain in the Deathwatch? Out of all the datasheets available, the single one that we see by far the most in competitive play is the Primaris Chaplain on Bike. Personally, I would also add the Firstborn Chaplain to the list due to his great many wargear options, including the jump pack for the extra mobility. Looking at the datasheet of the Biker Chaplain, what makes this one particularly great are the movement. He can auto-advance up to 20 inches, the toughness 5, 7 wounds, access to transhuman due to being Primaris, and then of course his large base. Unfortunately for us, the Primaris Chaplain on Bike has seen points increases, making him end up at 150 points when upgraded, which is steep, but he's still worth it, which says a lot. In contrast, the Firstborn Chaplain with jump pack will end up at the minimum of 130 points, making him a full 20 points cheaper than the Biker, but he is more fragile and has a much smaller base, which can turn out to be an issue. In turn, he gets some additional wargear options like a power fist or combi weapons. In terms of mobility, due to infantry and fly, he should end up being at least as fast as the Biker depending on terrain, so that should not make that much of a difference. Mobility is really key for chaplains, as you will want them bringing their litanies to the kill teams, and they make excellent candidates for carrying our Beacon and Chalice relic. Out of the Deathwatch HQ choices, nowadays the trio usually consists out of a chaplain, a watchmaster and a librarian, out of which the latter 2 are not primarily built for speed, making the chaplain our one HQ that should really be mobile. Mobility aside, there is the option to turn a chaplain into a beatstick, at which point I guess we can call him a slapling. This would be done through giving him both the Mantra of Strength litany, as well as additional relics and or warlord traits aimed at beatstick characters. It has to be said though, that very much like the Smasher/Captain, this concept has dropped out of fashion with Warzone Nephilim and the limited starting CP we get nowadays. Personally, as with all the HQs, I recommend building them primarily as buffing characters for your kill teams, rather than having them act as beatsticks. With what I consider the 2 competitive datasheets out of the way, what about the rest? As far as the Primaris Chaplain goes, the issue here is the lack of mobility. Then, as veteran viewers of this channel well know, I am not too fond of Terminator Armor HQs, simply because I think our buffing characters should be on the ground rather than arriving in later turns. For a chaplain in particular, if you were to teleport strike him in, he could beacon a kill team during turn 3 the earliest, which defeats the whole purpose of bringing the relic, not to mention that the movement of 5 once deployed makes him even slower than the foot-slogging Primaris variant I just dismissed. Then last but not least, Chaplain Cassius is yet another missed opportunity for Deathwatch. At first glance, he has some potential with his leadership of 10, fiery conviction already adding 1 to his litany rolls, as well as the optimized priority warlord trait, which is actually very decent nowadays. But unfortunately, he cannot become a master of Sanctity, and as a result knows 1 litany less, and his mobility is also an issue. Truly a shame, as this one had the potential to be the one decent named character for the Deathwatch. All in all, Chaplains make a great addition to almost any Deathwatch list, primarily whenever kill teams or even Dreadnoughts are brought into play, which is kind of what our competitive lists have been all about these past months, if not the entirety of 9th edition anyway. As I have argued before at one point or the other in the past, especially in Army of Renown lists with limited points outside of kill teams, I would go as far as prioritizing the Chaplain as the first HQ to pick, even before a Watchmaster, Captain or Librarian, though as covered in previous guides, they are all great picks and usually we do manage to squeeze in the trio of them. With that being said, let's have a look at some modeling recommendations. If you are going for the default Primaris Chaplain on bike, then you are pretty much set as it is, but I think it is worth mentioning that there is quite the potential for kit bashing your own. How so? Well, assuming that you are investing into Outriders, these come in 3 per box, and I would argue that there is no point to have more than 5 of them in a Deathwatch army. You might even get away with 4, depending on how you see the matter of infantry bikes, but the bottom line here is that regardless of whether you will end up playing 5 or 4, you will certainly have 1 spare. If you then also happen to have a spare foot-slogging chaplain, and that guy really shows up in a lot of box deals like combat patrols and the sorts, then you use the spare outrider as well as the foot-slogging chaplain to build your very own Primaris Chaplain on bike. That conversion aside, I think it is also great to have a Firstborn Chaplain, in which case I would recommend magnetizing both the jump pack as well as the 1 weapon arm not holding the Crozius Arcanum. In case you went for the Kill Team Cassius box, which has such beautiful models for various conversions, you can even take Chaplain Cassius himself, slap on a jump pack and you are good to go. To wrap things up, over the course of the video, we have looked at the various chaplains and what they bring to the Deathwatch nowadays. While the Primaris Chaplain on bike is by far the most popular pick in competitive play, the slightly cheaper Firstborn version with a jump pack can also be a viable alternative. In either case, it is recommended to always upgrade them to Master of Sanctity and investing into the wise Orator Warlord trait, as getting their litanies off on a 2+ rather than a 3+ makes them far more reliable. Speaking of litanies, as the default go-to, both Recitation of Focus and Canticle of Hate are excellent, but the final decision can of course depend on whatever exact list you are going for. While Chaplains have seen some play in the past, nowadays with the limited starting CP from Warzone Nephilim, I would recommend keeping them as buffing characters only, and they make very good candidates for carrying the Beacon and Chalice. Last but not least, in case you have a spare Outrider and otherwise useless foot-slugging Primaris Chaplain, you can kit bash these into your very own Primaris Chaplain on bike. So that's it for the Chaplains in the Deathwatch. Which variants are you guys using these days, or are you sticking to other HQs instead? Any good Chaplain or Beacon Pool stories you want to share with us, let me know in the comments. Finally, I would also like to mention that there is a SwissHammer Facebook page where I will be posting links to my videos, as well as articles I find of interest. I do read a lot about the hobby, but not all of it will always end up as its own video. I look forward to seeing you there as well. I do also have a Patreon page. If you like my content, any additional support is greatly appreciated as it helps me invest into future videos. As always, thank you very much for watching guys, your continued support is greatly appreciated. I hope you have been enjoying this video, give me a thumbs up if you did, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks again and see you next time.